Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. Today I am again joined by Phil Lawler and Paul McCusker to discuss art, literature, but particularly today, world building. And now, world building, of course, is common in both science fiction and fantasy. And to some extent, any fiction is some amount of world building because you have to create fictional characters. Even if it's historical fiction, there's fictional settings. But more specifically, I think that tonight's going to be dealing with the global picture of world building as you might see in a sword and sorcery fantasy or in science fiction. So one of the things that I sort of have, and I call these my 4 laws of world building, and this is sort of based off the fact that I think a good world needs to be consistent and starting with a firm philosophical foundation, working down from principles of ontology and laws like that are good. And so the first of the 4 I would say is, if it's possible in some possible world, if it's impossible in some possible world, don't use it. So in philosophy, we have a concept called possible worlds. And a possible world is just a complete description of the way reality might be. And so no possible world could 2 + 2 = 5. That's just impossible in all possible worlds. And so any fantasy creator should keep that in mind and avoid things like that. Now, if it's possible in some possible world, like, for example, an object is possible in some possible world if one can give a description of a possible world that includes that object. So, for example, in some possible world, the laws of physics could be different other than our own. And it would be, I think, permissible within this framework to then create an alternative physics to use in some possible world. The third rule would be suspend disbelief only once. For example, to give an example of this, Machiavelli in The Prince says that when a prince sets up a kingdom, he should only break the rules once. Because if he continually breaks the rules through acts of tyranny, it degrades people's respect for the rules and for the ruler. And the same holds for telling stories. So suspending disbelief in science fiction would be maybe spaceships and aliens, and in fantasy might be dragons and wizards. But if you're constantly breaking your own rules and other rules that we take for granted, it degrades the respect of the reader for the author, and it degrades the contiguity of the story. And then lastly, don't violate natures. So we have, like, for instance, in the Bible, demons, which are by nature evil. So you can't have a good demon. Sorry, D&D, it doesn't exist. You can't have good orcs like in the Warhammer universe. And you can't have God make a stone so big you can't move it. Natures are what they are. And I think one author that does all 4 of these extremely well is Tolkien. Tolkien was not himself necessarily a philosopher. He was a linguist and a historian and a folklorist, but he's working from a consistent philosophical position. And it shows throughout the rest of his work. Another rule, I guess you call it the Kurosawa rule. As Akira Kurosawa in his 2 films, Yojimbo and Sanjaro, we see a massive attention to detail. So, for example, in the street fight scene between Yojimbo and the other gangs, that city is a replica of a 19th century Japanese village, down to the minutest detail of carvings on the doors. Now, Kurosawa knew that most people wouldn't even be able to see the carvings on the doors that one would have expected in that time period in Japan. But it's a level of authenticity and immersion that Kurosawa is striving for. And his movie Sanjaro, where he has in the final scenes of the film people throwing flower petals into a stream as a signal for an attack. Each one of those flower petals was hand-painted red. I think they were chrysanthemums. And even though it was shot in black and white, so you wouldn't even really notice that they were red. And in fact, one of the people painting the flowers said to Kurosawa, "Why are you doing this?" And he's like, "Because you're not going to be able to see the colors." And he's like, it's about the authenticity. You have to put all your effort in there. And even if you sort of don't see it, you can't see it given the limited medium, it still leads for a more realistic, immersive experience. And I guess lastly, I'd bring up, think of world building as an iceberg. You look at maybe 10% at the top above the water, and that's what you introduce the reader to in your first novel. And the 90% would be under the water and would whet their appetite for further novels that you would want to write about. Introduce the reader to as far as the novel. And the 90%. And as far as the iceberg, I have to thank the Brandon Sanderson for that idea. He's a prominent science fiction writer from Utah. He works for the Brigham Young University. So those are just some of the ideas that I think make for a good, consistent world building experience. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. I think you covered it all, and thank you and good night.
Yeah, that's
it. We'll go now.
We'll be done now.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with anything you mentioned. So, you're going with Kurosawa, and I was thinking, yeah, it's just like Disneyland. They have those on Main Street. They have those names on the windows up above where people hardly ever even notice them. I'm thinking, wow, what a great detail. That's perfect. People wouldn't even necessarily see them, but they're there anyway. So you use, Kurosawa, I use Disneyland. It's indicative of where we are in our thought processes.
I would use the Jetsons. So I mean.
That's right.
Well, what I would say is that when I looked back on why did I like Lord of the Rings so much? Why did I like Tolkien's world so much? And why is he sort of the benchmark for fantasy world building in general? And I think these are some of the aspects. So, for example, natures. I like it with the elves and the ents, right? Evil can only corrupt. And so orcs and trolls are corruptions of good things, elves and ents. And that's the kind of attention to detail that you don't see, because you'll see kind of like modern day fantasy with its more nihilistic implications, these weird mashups that just don't make any sense.
Yeah. And the truth is, by the way, sorry, Phil, it's just, whether you're creating a science fiction world or a representation of the world as we know it here, and whatever the case may be, all the things you mentioned are vital to not only an authentic and the ring of truth that we all aspire to have in our stories, whether it's drama, fiction, whatever the case may be, but also it's a good parameter that keeps us within the discipline of the craft. Because if you don't have a consistent world, it becomes all too easy for writers, for example, to simply have something magically appear in order to get a character out of trouble. For example, the cliffhanger is readily undone. There's no real dramatic tension, because if you can cheat the world, if you can cheat in order to do whatever you want to do, much like it feels like Doctor Who does at various times, but that's a whole other conversation. But if you can sort of manufacture things easily, a dramatic tension is gone. And so all the things you described is not only imperative to an experience that we hope people will have in our stories, but imperative for us as the ones creating. We need those rules. We need to follow them and stay true to them. Otherwise, all bets are off, and we've diminished the power of whatever story we're trying to tell. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add to that was the idea that, as you were describing it, sort of reminded me of Calvin and Hobbes, where they make up a game, and they can make up any rules they want to the game at any time to get them out of trouble. Calvin did that completely, and that of course is a very childlike thing to do. And of course, as we grow up, as in terms of scripture, we want to put away childish things while keeping the innocence of childhood in our writing, keeping the wonder, keeping the joy, keeping all of those types of things, and still go on to produce things that are worthy of, for lack of a better term, adult attention. I think what you were talking about there, Paul, is very much like the Deus Ex Machina. Let's get our character into some sort of trouble, then change the rules to have God get him out of trouble. So, I mean, sometimes those things work. I think a brilliant sort of poking fun at those rules comes in the movie Adaptation, where if you get a chance to see it, he breaks all of the writing rules that we're talking about here, but he does it purposefully. That's Charlie Kaufman, and he's brilliant at doing things like that. And we've all seen other examples where, we love these rules, but they're completely broken in terms of the film.
Monty Python. Monty Python did it all the time.
Does it all the time. Paul, I remember very distinctly you and I talking when the first Jurassic Park movie came out. It was the same thing. Yeah. You know, the T-Rex comes in and saves them. It's at the end. It's like, well, wait a minute, hold on. And the whole reason for doing that, of course, is that Spielberg wanted that lovely shot of the T-Rex in the visitor center saying, the most terrifying monsters in the world, or whatever it was. So I think that that you cover, like as Paul was saying, you covered all the bases there, Todd, on all of this stuff. I think that we can simplify it perhaps by using some different sort of examples, just from myself, from my own writing. I know Paul has similar examples as well. We can go back to Adventures in Odyssey. The story I tell over and over again with Adventures in Odyssey is the guy that I really admired when I was growing up was a guy named Paddy Chayefsky, who wrote many teleplays, many screenplays. He won an Oscar for Marty, but he also won an Oscar for The Hospital, I believe, and Network, the film The Hospital and Network. And those two films in particular influenced my writing, and especially as we were sitting down to create Adventures in Odyssey, because what Chayefsky, his whole modus operandi was, I have to know everything about this world. I have to know everything there is to know about the world that I'm going to write about. How can I explain it to other people if I don't know everything there is to know about it? So he did the whole history of the hospital in the hospital, and he did the whole history of the network in the network. He knew everybody, all the movers and shakers, all the players, everybody was there, down to, what they had for breakfast that morning. And that was before he ever wrote a word of dialogue or fade in on the screenplay. So this is extremely important, very imperative.
I think one of the other points, and this gets to our general telos of art that we mentioned last time, is when there was a great skit put together by, I think it was the Chesterton Club, and it had C.S. Lewis meeting Tolkien, and Sir Lewis is still an atheist here. And so what Lewis, he's saying, you can't believe in fairy tales, Tolkien, this is for kids, this is just all made up. And, Tolkien's like, no, this stuff is fictional, not real in the sense of flesh and blood. I can see it right in front of my hand. But what it does is it allows us to experience ordinary truths in an extraordinary way so that we can look at them with fresh eyes again. And when we come back to the real world, we can, again, I think it's best put at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. When Aslan tells Lucy and Edmund when they're too old to go back to Narnia, Lucy's like, will you ever see you again? He's like, yeah, you'll see me back in the world you came from, where you know me by another name. But you came to this world so that you could learn how to better serve me in this world. And I think all good world buildings, good not just in a sense of good craftsmanship, but good in the moral sense, are worlds that will give the reader a better view of God, reality, and who they are, and how they can then learn, all the basic virtues of truth, justice, beauty, goodness, and better apply that to our real world. And I think Tolkien and Lewis are exemplary in that regard.
Well, yeah, they are, and again, even when we're talking outside of the realm of science fiction, and we're talking about this world, the world as we know it, the same principles. God is a God of order. There is an order to this, but the best part of it is not a fixed order in such a way that there's nothing left to discover, but that we're constantly discovering things within that order. So even when we say that a world that we create has a fixed reality, the danger, I think, for some of us in our writing is we get so fixed that it becomes rigidity and there's nothing to discover. We follow certain rules in order to explore and discover more within it, thus the deeper magic in Chronicles of Narnia, or within the world of let's say, the Middle Earth. There were things that you were consistent. Just when you thought, oh, well, this is the world, then you realize there's another layer to it that isn't a cheat. It's not a convenient cheat by the writer just to try to resolve a situation or whatever, but it actually, you realize, no, this world it expands into the miraculous. It expands into a deeper understanding of who Gandalf was. And you can use all of those examples. The best worlds in the best fiction tend to be dynamic enough that even within their consistency, there's so much left to be discovered about them.
Sure, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I had a great philosophy professor when I was in grad school. Actually, it may have been an undergrad, but he said something to the effect of, one definition of myth is pointing us stories that point us to eternal truths. It's very much the same way as parables would be. Jesus was using parables to show eternal truths. And we often think of myths as just made up stuff that lies, that are basically lies. But that's not the classical definition of myth. You mentioned at the beginning, Todd, something about the consistency of the universe as well. In all parts of the universe, 4 plus 4 equals 8, and 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you can't really change those kinds of things. Well, interestingly enough, of course, Descartes was the one who embodied extreme skepticism and was saying, yeah, but what if we have an evil monster who's only convincing us that 4 plus 4 is 8 and 2 plus 2 is 4? So how can I trust that? How can I trust anything about me that is real or not real? And of course, Descartes' answer to that was his cogito ergo sum. And then he built everything else back up, including belief in God on top of that, which then, for hundreds of years, philosophers attempted to knock down again. That's what we do in philosophy. But at any rate, but the idea behind it is solid. The idea that you're saying, what you're saying, Todd, is quite solid in terms of saying we're really looking to create other worlds. And this is where I think perhaps your complaint or your concern with some of the more modern world building that's been going on lately. This is where perhaps this hits a little closer to it. And that's the idea that the problem with modern world building is that they want to create something that we don't understand as being reflective of who we are in reality. And I think good world building does that. Good world building points us back to who we are, to our core humanity and the things that our core beliefs and those things that our core sensibilities, what we know, what we believe to be true, and that correspond to the world around us. We know what a lion is, and we know what talking is, and what the brilliance of C.S. Lewis was he combined the lion talking to create Aslan. That's only one aspect of his character, of course. But he put human children in a brand new world. But that brand new world wasn't completely alien and foreign to them. Even the world of magic, which J.K. Rowling delved in, still had all of the spells seemed to be just things that we recognize as things that we would do, perhaps using technology, but they used a different kind of technology, if you want.
Clark's Law.
Yeah. So I think that what everybody is saying here, we're all kind of in agreement, which I'm not quite sure makes for great radio, but at least for great audio programming and podcasting. But we are in agreement that what we're looking to do is is in our writing, create worlds that point us back to the human condition, point us back to the truths of the human condition and the universal truths that we all understand. And again, goes back to what we were saying last time, which is the innate ability back to Romans 1 of saying we understand God, who God is, what God is, and all of the implications that go along with that. And we may be trying to reject that, but we can't reject it because this is who we are. We're humans.
One poor example of modern world building that tends to break all of these rules is Philip Pullman's attempt to create a child's atheistic version of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Dark Materials. Now, I only read The Golden Compass, but it was so awful, I couldn't get any further. Like, literally, he'll set up one rule, 3 chapters ago, and then he'll directly contradict it 3 chapters later. And he does this all the time. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's all these Deus Ex Machinas pulling Lyra out of problems that she really shouldn't be getting out of. And it's just, and it's also just kind of a flat world. There's nothing really magical or exciting about it. I mean,
isn't that born out of his desire to deconstruct basically traditional sensibilities, traditional morality? He's trying to deconstruct essentially everything that Lewis constructed. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's postmodern or what that is, but he essentially, in his desire to be the anti-Lewis, also made himself an anti-storyteller based on everything you're saying. I just wasn't that interested in reading his books because I thought they're already agenda laden, and I just couldn't feel any compelling reason to throw myself or invest my time or energy into something that I knew was filled with that kind of agenda. It's not even honest because it's not an exploration anymore. Because Lewis at his best was always an exploration. He said in interviews, he didn't start any of his stories with an agenda. He didn't start with a message that he was necessarily trying to tell. He began with an idea. And then through the exploration of that idea, the themes would emerge, and he'd bring his disciplines to the forefront in terms of how he crafted the story. But you could later say perhaps he had an agenda that was Christian in terms of what he was trying to do, and that might have been a motivating impulse, but it was not the actual impetus for it in terms of I'm going to start with a message and end with that message. I think if most people heard that, they would say, well, why would I want to read it? Because I'm either for that message or I'm against it. So if I hear Pullman saying, yep, I'm the anti-Lewis, I'm immediately thinking this man has already now thoroughly, completely constrained himself from the possibility of good storytelling. So why would I bother?
Right. Chesterton was noted for, I'm paraphrasing him now, I don't know if I'm going to give you the direct quote, but here's the idea. He was noted for saying art consists in knowing where to draw the line. It has to start where to draw a line. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind what you said is very interesting. Listening to both of you talk, you heard words like Todd. You mentioned the Golden Compass. The world was flat. It was just a very flat, non-dynamic world. And then Paul, you mentioned the idea of Lewis undertaking the disciplines of writing. Well, we see this, don't we? If you have unfettered stuff, it's all unfettered. This seems to be what we're getting at here with some of the world building that we see in more modern literature. When it's unfettered, it's completely unfettered. It does the exact opposite of what you think it's going to do, which is it seems to open up all sorts of avenues of creativity. Wow, we can do everything now. This world can be anything that we want it to be, and it ends up being boring.
Chaos.
Yeah, boring. It's all chaos. Yeah. I think there's an actual.
It's nothing.
Well, chaos becomes unto itself white noise, and artists have been guilty of this. I know certain musicians who are incredibly clever, but in the sense that you almost feel a randomness to what it is that they're throwing into their music and what they're doing. Yeah. And after a while, the cleverness becomes boring because there's just so much of it. There's no discipline around how they build or structure what they do. And then you just kind of get tired. I mean, it's like after a while, even the most thrilling roller coaster ride, that's why they only last a couple of minutes. Because you sit on one of those things for 10 minutes and not only might you get sick, but you are going to get bored. You just want the thing to stop. The thrill is gone after a couple of minutes because it seems so wild. So it's the discipline and structure of creating these worlds and of telling good stories, I think, that allows us to basically do the magic tricks, Yeah. Even the magicians know how to structure and build what trick they do from one moment to the next to impress and to do what it is that they do. In many ways, I think we're magicians in much the same way.
Yeah, you're hitting on going back to popular culture here. You're hitting on the whole thing of The Incredibles when the guy stole all of the superhero powers from everybody else and says, I'm going to give them to everybody. And that way, when everybody's a superhero, nobody will be. Bill Evans does the same thing. Bill Evans is a very great jazz pianist, if you know anything about him. And he talked about this whole sort of thing, how jazz can be this cacophony of noise, or jazz can be this wonderful musical expression. But it depends on how much you know about music. You still have to understand the basic foundations of music. You still have to undergo the disciplines of musical study and practice in order to be able to do the really cool stuff that you want to do on top of it. It still has to be based on a foundation, a bedrock foundation of good, solid discipline and practice. And that's what we've lost, I think, in a lot of respects. That we don't really, a lot of modernity really doesn't want to go back and everything should be free and open. Everything should be clear. But, you got to have the boundaries somewhere. You've got to understand the boundaries to know how to break the boundaries. You have to understand the boundaries in order to know how to manipulate them or to know how to reflect them honestly.
Well, and we're always in a position as creators and storytellers, we're banking on and counting on the patience of our audience. I mean, it simply comes down to that sometimes. I mean, especially in this very ADD age where you've only got a little bit of time to kind of hook people, get them in and get them to stay with you, that if you get so lost in your own reality and it's an unstructured, chaotic thing, after a little bit, the audience is going to go, you know what? I don't have the patience to figure out whether this jazz is just chaos or if there's a method to its madness. I don't have the patience to figure out whether this story ultimately will be good, because right now in the first chapter it's so random and beyond my understanding. I don't know that I care to hang in there long enough to understand what it is they're trying to do. So there's always the basic rules of storytelling or music or whatever that you have to be judicious in many ways about it. There's a higher risk. The more avant-garde or the more out there we try to be, unless we apply those in the context of a discipline that will capture attention and maintain a reason to stay with it, why would anybody bother? And then you've got an audience of the artist and maybe his mother. I don't know.
Well, there was a good point that you made earlier, Phil, is that people, they don't want to do the discipline. There's this lie that people tell themselves that it's all of this great work was in a moment of white heat inspiration without any work. And, you just, and this ties into the sort of like individualist myth of liberalism. If you just get rid of these external forces and the inner creativity of people, it's going to just automatically bubble to the surface. When, no, to get to be as creative as a Shakespeare or a Da Vinci or a Mozart, it takes tremendous amounts of work, discipline, and deferred gratification. Now, that's not to say there aren't moments of white heat inspiration, but you don't build work off that. You can, in fact, only fully appreciate that white hot heat of inspiration once you've done the hard work to then utilize it.
Well, and the Beatles knew that. Any interview with any of the Beatles, especially if you go back to the anthology, the question was put to them about when they tried to create music while taking LSD and while taking drugs. And all of them admitted that generally they'd have the white heat of inspiration, which they normally didn't remember, by the way, the next day. They'd record all this stuff, and then the next day they would go back and listen to what they had done, and it was rubbish. It was complete. They used a stronger word than I'm using, but it was complete rubbish, and they knew that it was. So what was happening in the white heat, they then picked up that even while certain aspects of perhaps their drug taking inspired some ideas, more often than not, it just came back to raw discipline mixed with their creativity, the creativity and talent they'd been born with. And it was just an amazing combination of both.
Without the discipline, you couldn't even see the inspiration for what it is.
Right. I mean, let's take a different aspect. That's not necessarily in the artistic realm, but there's an art to it. Parenting. Look at your stories as though they're children. All right. Well, what happens to an undisciplined child? Well, what do we call an undisciplined child who's just free to be doing whatever they want to do and has no boundaries at all? We call that child a monster.
Oh, I was going to say my son, but I guess I got that wrong. Sorry. Okay, monster. All right, sorry. I retract that. I didn't mean that. I was joking. Tommy, I was kidding.
We love you, Tommy. He's a great kid. But the idea behind it is still the same. I mean, it's the idea behind it is you have to. It's unpleasant stuff. It's the hard part of artistry. There's a certain amount of copiousness that you have to be able to attain in order to be able to sit down and start writing something that's worth reading, or sit down and write something that's worth recording and in any kind of discipline, filming, whatever it is that we're doing. You have to have all of that training, and you have to abide by certain rules and regulations. Some of those rules and regulations may be, arbitrary, but we still understand them and know that they're there, and that we have to abide by them in order to tell the story in the best way.
Well, and the ones that have lasted are not even arbitrary, but it was C.S. Lewis, and I think T.S. Eliot, actually, and I think we may have said the same thing in the last thing. It was T.S. Eliot in a bad paraphrase, which was, you got to know what the rules are before you break them.
Yeah.
And because when you think about it, I don't even know how to answer this question. What is a painting without a frame?
Right.
Everything we do, every creative effort has a frame around it in some form, whether it's discipline of words, comprehensible words, or painting, or a visual in terms of film, or whatever the case may be. If you're not working within a frame, I'm not entirely sure what that is, because frankly, I can't think of any such thing. A painting without a frame is just what, endless colors? I don't even know what it is. Because everything creatively, much like even where we appear on a camera in this conversation, the frame gives us focus, and the focus tells us, okay, I'm zeroing in and looking at this part of reality, whether
Right.
it's a reality we know here or a reality I'm creating, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Now, I do have a question, though, since we're agreeing and there's no conflict in this, but I'd be curious if we could talk a little bit about, for example, the evolution of Adventures in Odyssey.
Yeah, sure.
Because Phil, you and I have talked a lot about how Odyssey became, even subconsciously in many respects, a reflection of our two different experiences, life experiences, where you came from and the world you know, even the physical world, and then what I came from, and how it became this sort of blending, which means early on in Odyssey, I want to say we were sort of discovering the world even while we were creating it. Does that make sense? So it was this combination of the character of Wit, who we seemed to understand, but there were nuances and differences in how we were kind of coming at him. Wit's End, the town of Odyssey, was sort of expanding and contracting. I think I remember the first conversation we had about there being a mall. I put a mall outside of town. It was like, wait a minute, wait. It has a mall? It was going, well, it's got a train station. And then we introduced an airport. It was like, wait a minute, how big is this town? And I said, well, it's not a large airport. But, so it kept shifting and changing. But at the heart of it, in the essence of it, we seem to still be working around the same rules and reality. Does that make sense? Yeah. And yet we were discovering it as we went along.
I think that's an accurate statement. I mean, there was a lot of preliminary work done on it, and then what happens with any artist is any artist comes in and we start putting stuff together into the project. And I think Odyssey was very much this way. You're very correct, Paul. There was something that I had in my head, and then when you came and we started working together, then it was like it started morphing into something else. And part of that was just, I think, born out of the idea that we created what we needed. So Wit's End, the physical building of Wit's End became as big or as small as we needed it to be. And the same with the town of Odyssey. It became as big or as small as we needed it to be. I think that we tried, I do remember having these conversations at one point saying we want a place that still feels like a small town, but that can have bigger town problems if we need it to have bigger town problems. So the idea behind it is, and then I kind of changed my thinking on this, but I'll lay this out and then tell you how my thinking process sort of changed on it. The idea was behind this was, well, how if the town is too small, how is it going to be the center of all this national and international intrigue that we seem to be wanting to put it into certain storylines? And then I thought, well, the reason why, of course, is because of the character of Wit and the character of Jason, and the characters make it that way. So it doesn't really matter how big the town is that they live in. People are going to come to that town because of them. So we're kind of branching off now into is not only world building in terms of the world itself, but world building in terms of the people we put in the world.
Well, and I remember, by the way, one of my favorite conversations that we had was one of the scripts that you wrote, and you'll probably remember what it was. But you actually described that because it opened outside of Odyssey, it opened somewhere else, completely different. And I remember when we were meeting and talking about it, you were trying to explain that what you were trying to do was, it's basically like Gilligan's Island, where you have these military guys standing there going, yes, I think it is time. We need to detonate that bomb, but we got to do it where nobody is. And so let's find a place on the map. And then they show the map and it's Gilligan's Island. I mean,
Right.
So you have this external force, which Gilligan's Island, by the way, always had to do. Because there was a point where to create conflict and challenges, you had those that they might create within themselves, but then you always had some surfer dude or some guy pretending to be Tarzan or whatever he was coming in. But I remember that conversation because it was one way that we got our brains around the idea that Odyssey was sort of became this magnet because of some of the people who were there. Wit and Jason and the guys naturally drew things to the town. And so it was sort of our Gilligan's Island, to put it crudely, and in the sense that in order to expand the reality we'd created, we needed to go outside. But then we also had to have a plausible reason for the outside to come rushing in, for anything to happen.
And by the way, those things don't change. We're still dealing with that 30, 31 years later. We're still dealing with the whole idea, because how many but I think that was part of also what was in the back of our brains, at least subconsciously, perhaps, when we were creating the world, which was the idea of, okay, yes, this story is about this guy named Whit, and some of and there's Connie, and there's Eugene, and we've created those characters that this world basically revolves around. But by the same token, because it's a town, this was very purposeful. I do remember this, because it's a town, we have people coming and going all the time, so we can expand it in that respect. We gave ourselves the flexibility of saying, okay, things can happen here.
But even the internal
elsewhere can happen here.
Yeah, and even that internal reality that was Wit's End, the place.
Right.
We talked about it being like Snoopy's doghouse, where it could be almost anything. In fact, I remember, I think you and I both were alarmed because Clubhouse Magazine at the time decided they were going to do sort of a map of Wit's End. And we said,
I created a map right from the very beginning.
But what I mean though is we worked from this, but our concern was, as soon as you locked certain things in, we had two immediate problems. And I remember what they were. Three actually. We had one, which was, do we really want to lock the fans into that image? Because suddenly when we've created a room, somebody's going to go, well, that's not on the map. Where is that on the map?
Right.
The second thing was, how it would constrain us. There was the other thing we worried about was consistency, which, by the way, we had fans who then wrote in and said, but that map isn't right, because remember in this episode where so-and-so climbed out the bathroom window? Well, the bathroom window in this map doesn't have a window, so that's wrong. And then the third thing, which I remember being more worried about, was that our sound designers were going to count how many steps it took to get from the counter to the kitchen, which meant that every time we wrote a script where Eugene goes from the counter to the kitchen, these guys would be coming back to us and saying, well, he couldn't get from the counter to the kitchen in the amount of time because it's that far away. And I'm going, no, really, I just need him to get from the counter to the kitchen. How nearby he is. Could we please just get him there without me timing out 20 seconds to make sure that it works? I mean,
what I find to be really gratifying about all of that, though, later on, at first it was like a kind of a pain, but now it's sort of gratifying. The idea behind it, that we did our jobs really well. We created this world that everybody thought was so believable that it has to make sense. It has to make sense for them to be able to get from here to here. And if there's that distance of time and we have something happening really, really fast that way, well, that's not believable. That's not believable. Right. So the whole idea behind what I think we were trying to do, and whether we were successful or not depends on, I guess, your point of view, but is the idea that we did want to create this believable world. And to the extent that we did it well, I mean, people were writing into us saying, we're making our vacation plans and we want to go to Odyssey. How do we get there? Mm-hmm. And they were serious. People were seriously writing into Focus on the Family saying, we really would like to go to the town of Odyssey. Where we get that? And I said, I don't think you can get inside of our brains. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. This all exists up here.
On that note, where exactly is Odyssey? According to Family Portraits, it was in Ohio, but then according to...
No. That was Mike Trout. Mike Trout kind of threw that somewhere, said it was Ohio to somebody in some interview.
Yeah.
And of course, Mike Trout, as I recall, never actually wrote a single episode. So I may be wrong, but I don't remember his name going on there. Mike,
it was in one of the introductions to Focus broadcast. I think it was actually.
So they were talking about it, and
I think it was actually during Family Portraits is when that happened. He was introducing the Odyssey, and said it was a small town in Ohio. We're like, no. We're purposefully not doing that. So,
and I think when we were on the anniversary cruise, the question came up, and I think the response from all of us, was really, we want Odyssey to be your town.
Yeah.
If we pinpoint it somewhere and it's in Illinois or it's in Pennsylvania or it's in Oregon or wherever it is,
right,
in many ways it's not your town anymore.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
and there have been a lot of fans who've actually tried to figure out, based on the clues, how we got mountains and then we've got this, and the one thing we know it doesn't have is an ocean. You know, but then again, I don't remember we ever said it doesn't have an ocean.
I don't remember.
we just never let them go there. So
closest town was Chicago. So where is a place that's close enough to Chicago that they would fly out of Chicago in order to get to? You know, they're trying to triangulate the thing.
or take a train. You know, but I have to confess.
This is very much like Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon. You know,
yeah.
How he explains Lake Wobegon is that the surveyors, when they were surveying the state, kept overlapping at one point, and so basically they just surveyed Lake Wobegon out of existence. it does exist, but not on maps. So you can't find it. They just kind of surveyed it out of existence, and I go, okay, well that's good enough for me for Odyssey too.
Yeah. Okay, I'm getting a message from Todd. I see that we're still live, but he's saying, call me a dummy later. I accidentally exited the stream. I have to start over. So I don't know if whatever we're saying is still watchable or if he's basically cut the connection. So
I think we're still live. So
we're live somewhere, but I think, I don't know if this means he has to start over or we have to go to this link.
Does he want us to go to
I know. I'll write to him.
Yeah.
By the way,
we can still, while we're doing that, we can still talk about.
Well, one of the funny things is where I got into big trouble, by the way, was when I was doing some of the Odyssey novels, and I decided to do the story of the Underground Railroad and how it went through Odyssey.
Yeah.
And suddenly I was in a huge conundrum. I had a big problem because in order to try to figure out how to tell the story for that to happen, I had to figure out where it was or to write in a way so that I could still have it, but not reference the exact details so it still came through, because I had the journey through Odyssey.
Right.
So that was a bit of a trick.
And this is a problem again, like we were saying, that we're still facing in today, virtually today. So for instance, I wanted to do a Civil War episode recently, and I did a Civil War episode. And it was based on actual events that happened, that I thought happened where we might put the area of Odyssey that Odyssey might be located in, and of course you put historical figures in the mix with Odyssey, and now you're going, okay, well, we really are pinpointing kind of a location, and perhaps that's okay. I mean, I don't necessarily know that that's something that we want to shy away from. I'm having the same problem with the Blackard novels. The same kind of thing. The Blackard Chronicles is going back and taking a look at where all of this stuff is, just the geography of the town, where everything is. What we need to have happen requires so much study of what we did. So I just internal study. We have to have an encyclopedia of Odyssey to be able for me to sit down and say, okay, the next I just completed the novels that deal with the nemesis and the battle. And so now the next big thing that happens with Blackard, we'll have to complete the book that deals with Waylaid in the Windy City. Well, Richard Maxwell says certain things about himself in Waylaid in the Windy City that I go, okay, well, we have to set that up. That's got to be set up somewhere. I can't just be something we spring on everybody. The whole idea behind these novels is we're telling the backstory. So if we have to tell the backstory, it has to be plausible that between the time that Richard Maxwell got sent away for the things he did in the battle, and the time that we next see him in Waylaid in the Windy City, he's going to have some sort of experience here, and so this is where this is air. By the way,
we're back on now.
No, we're live.
Everyone, I accidentally exited out of the video. This happened once before. It happens. But
Phil and I had an amazing conversation for all that time, and you know what? Frankly, I just can't repeat it. I'm too bored to even try to repeat it. So,
no, I'm sorry, guys, but
so we'll just pick up. We'll pick up wherever you want to pick up.
One of my philosophies.
That was the whole plan, Paul. The whole plan was so that I could set the new discussion tone.
Okay.
No, but
said the same thing. He used to say the same thing about stuff like that. He'd say, this is the reason I don't want cell phones and I don't want anything else in my class, because we're talking about stuff. And if you ask me to repeat it, I can't repeat it. I don't know. I was brilliant then. I'm not brilliant anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I will say this one thing though, that it was interesting is you and your Paul, rather, you did an interview once with Mark Hamby of Lamplighter Publishing, and he made an interesting point that he asked some big directors and TV movie producers, what's the best inspiration to get started making fiction, and they said, was it theology, history, philosophy? Basically laying down the foundations for any sort of well thought out, consistent, rational position. And I think that, philosophy, it's really hard to underestimate, right? In the Middle Ages, it was called the handmaiden to theology. It really is sort of almost the starting point. You have to start from, and then you work out from there.
Right.
To add consistency.
So,
now,
so was there a question in there? I'm not sure what you were asking.
I was just pointing out, jumping off that interview, the importance of what he was talking about.
Sure.
And with history, this is where we get lived human experiences. Like if you're going to have believable characters in your world, you need to have lived human experiences. And where else are you going to get them? Because our own lived experiences can provide some of that, but it's too narrow of a scope to fill a whole world with. And that's where history can come in. And I thought that was a particularly insightful aspect of your interview with Mark Hamby.
Well, and the problem with it is I'd be inclined to check if I had to pick one of those three: theology, philosophy, or history. Yeah, I'd have to say history, because theology is in many ways an interpretation of one aspect. Philosophy is an interpretation of another aspect, overlapping. But you're right. If we're going to write characters and story and whatever we're going to do, theology and philosophy may pervade what we write. It can prove to inform and pervade the writing, but because, as you say, history is in and of itself life experience, which we then take and structure into what's called a story. I mean, we're basically taking life experience, whether it's on this planet or some other planet or wherever, Alpha Centauri, but you're still creating a frame around these moments, these things that are the structure of a story, a beginning, a middle, end, all of the things that make for a compelling story. And but the problem with the question is it almost feels like a trick question anyway, because you want to say it's all the above. I mean, really, I don't know how you do it without any one of those things.
Well, what we're looking for, I think, when we're doing history is the philosophy and theology and contained in it. Those are the things, those are the richness, those are what makes, for me anyway, and I think that this is probably true for most folks, that those are the things that make history rich. Those are the things that make history worth studying and worth wanting to present worthwhile. So yeah, I think that I would agree with that. I think from on a gut level, I would say, yeah, you're probably right. But then again, I'm a philosopher, so I would always default to philosophy.
Ah, good man. Me too. But on the philosophy note, one thing that I find to be interesting and way to evaluate world building is the author should be self-aware enough to be consistent with his own philosophy. So let's say that the author's an atheist, like Philip Pullman. His world is not consistent with his own values of atheism and what atheism actually implies for the world. So an author who does create a world who is consistent with his atheism is H.P. Lovecraft. He is consistent with the implications of a world without God. And we can compare the two and see that Lovecraft is superior because he's more consistent, more self-aware of the implications of what his worldview leads to. So it's not even that the worldview has to be correct, though that helps a lot. But as long as it's a consistent worldview and you're self-aware of it enough to that you're in your own literature be consistent with it.
Though that suggests, though, that an author must be consistent with his worldview or her worldview. Because the fact is, there's nothing that would stop me from writing a novel that encompasses lots of an idea of atheism, for example. In other words, if we're creating compelling characters and I write a character that's an atheist, I have to make sure that he's consistent as an atheist, whether I agree with the character or not. I've actually done lots of stories or dramas about people I don't always agree with. And yet to make them good, I have to be true to what I'm representing. Does that make sense? Even with what I'm representing is not consistent with my worldview. If I'm doing a thing about a serial killer, you know, and I'm trying to do it in a compelling way, it's not about me, and it's not about what I believe. It's about telling a compelling story around that character and the life of the serial killer. However, having said that, the truth is that very often our worldview does bubble to the top, as Lewis would say. It bubbles to the top in the broader philosophy, the broader worldview, in the sense that if I'm doing a thing about a serial killer, and that serial killer simply gets away with killing everybody and nothing ever stops him, where does that go? What am I communicating as the author of the book when I can make a choice about whether the serial killer gets caught or not? Or does he ever have a moment of conscience? Or if he does, what does that look like? I'm still communicating a lot about what I believe as an author in the structure and what I have the character do, even though the character's doing things that I might find reprehensible. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I think another thing, too, to consider is if you have a book with people of different religions, so you have a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian, but let's say you as the author are a Christian, then you have to juggle, on the one hand, the sort of meta reality that you believe to be true, that is, as a Christian, but you also want to be consistent with how people would act in their beliefs according to their, which we would believe, false worldview.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult thing to do that many authors and worldview builders do not do so well.
Well, and Phil and I talked about this for ages, by the way. And when we were writing Odyssey, for example, whenever we would do an episode that was outside of our experience, we always tried to make sure. I remember we talked about this. We said, even though it's out, especially because it's outside of my experience, I have to work harder to make sure it's true to the experience of what I'm writing about. So if I'm writing about a single mom, or if I'm writing about a kid who was abandoned, or an orphan, or I mean, just think of any circumstance that would be outside of my normal experience, I do have to work harder. And we talked about it with Odyssey. If we're going to do the story, it has to ring true to the person who really has experienced those things, because if we don't do that, then we shouldn't do it, because that's not good storytelling. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think also, I mean, going back to the beginning of this little segment that we're talking about here, what makes that difficult is if we're writing for a character whose worldview is different from our own, and trying to keep them consistent within that worldview. Well, it's difficult when that worldview isn't consistent. So I would argue from the standpoint, going back to the beginning of this, that atheism is not a consistent worldview. Atheism cannot get away from theology at all, in my opinion. For me, atheist is a person who gets in the car to drive the car into the ditch, but you're still in the car. You can't get away from it, no matter which way you look at it. From the
and G.K. Chesterton said that there must be a God, because if there wasn't, there wouldn't be any atheists. Yeah,
exactly. That's very true. I totally botched that Chesterton quote from the very beginning, at the very beginning of this conversation, by the way, because what he basically said was art, like morality, consists in drawing a line somewhere. Yeah. But which goes back to the whole idea of discipline. But I think that he was spot on as far as that's concerned in terms of the whole notion of consistency of atheism. We see the same thing when we're talking about, as we go back to what we said a little earlier about if all bets are off as far as any kind of belief system is concerned, as far as any kind of discipline or anything else is concerned, well, what do you have? You have something that's fairly boring, I think. So how does that inform your story? How does that work? The most interesting story, I think, the most interesting example of this, I think, was the movie Contact, and there was a novel also by Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan and his wife wrote that novel years and years ago, and then it was turned into a film by Robert Zemeckis. And I show this film in my popular culture class, and we use it as, as religion versus science, I suppose, the discussion. It informs that discussion. But what's quite interesting about it, of course, and this is spoiler alert, if you want to go see the video, it's still worth watching. But the idea behind it is that the main character, Ellie, she rejects religion completely, uses religious, the religious and philosophically religious arguments in order to try to reject it. And you say, well, wait a minute, but you're using those same arguments to justify your own belief system, which is based all on science. I remember very clearly in philosophical studies talking about fact, truth, and religion, that they get bigger as you go up. The facts are we know very few factual things. They're usually tautologies like 1 = 1 or space is big. But that doesn't do us a whole lot of good in realms of knowledge. You have to have, as soon as science steps out and says, okay, we have this fact, now what do we do with it? As soon as they say, what do we do with it? You're entering into the realm of truth. You're not entering, you've left science, now you're dealing with truth. And then how then should we live based on this truth enters into the realm of religion. So you can't really just stop at one place. When we have, I think, a lot of problems in our society because we think that people who are scientists have the answers, but the scientists are really just being philosophers and theologians just in a different way. And that's a big problem.
Well, what you're describing in Contact is a self-performative contradiction. You're performing what you claim can't be done. And that's a big problem for atheism as a worldview. And we also see how they don't tell good stories. I mean, the Golden Compass compared to C.S. Lewis is it's no contest, and everybody knows it. I mean, the Golden Compass bombed in the box office compared to the Narnia movies. Which
the problem I have with saying that it bombed at the box office, though, from our standpoint, let's talk strictly on the standpoint of Christians, the religious folks out there. Why it bombed was because of the author's atheism. That, for me, is a problem. What we really want to say, I think, is that go see it because it's a bad story. It was not told well. It bombed artistically, and that's where we have, I think, a problem on our side because we're not separating the art from it. And I don't know that you can separate. I don't want to necessarily separate the art from it, but I want us to understand why. Let's get past the knee-jerk reaction of, oh, this is all about atheism, and we don't want that. No, let's get past that from saying what's good art from bad art. This goes back to the last conversation we had. What is good art versus bad art? What is good storytelling versus bad storytelling? That's what we should be really concerned about in the realm of art. And our worldview obviously reinforces all of that. But that the primary thing should not necessarily be, well, this is a story by an atheist. A lot of atheists tell really great religious stories. Really, really great religious stories. They in some respects better than we do.
And we always have to be careful, as you say, about judging them. I mean, what's the old thing? Never judge a book by its movie. Because the fact is, some would argue that artistically, not all of the Narnia movies were very well done or that. So some of it is the execution. It has to do with the representation in film, what may have been a great book. We all know films that were not good representations of the books. And then there are other books, actually, that were made better by the films were made of them, where they applied.
I'll give you one example of one that was definitely made more intelligible by the film, even though it wasn't something that I particularly liked. But Akira, the manga was a mess. I mean, it just made no sense. Nihilism out, the wazoo. The film still was nihilistic, but it made more sense because they cut out so much of the crazy nonsense in the manga that I'm like, this actually makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they had to bring a certain discipline to it that sharpened what the novelist or what the original writing took a lot of liberties with.
Yeah, it's the discipline of the filmmaker. I'll give you another one. I think Frank Darabont did a great job. I think the movie Shawshank Redemption is much better than the.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I think the movie The Green Mile is better than the books The Green Mile.
Well, there's another thing too. One really interesting world. Now I don't know if you've seen it. Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki. That's a really interesting world where I guess like it's an Earth-like world that was destroyed by an atomic holocaust.
Sure.
And the remnants of humanity are trying to survive. And there's giant Titan walkers that were used to destroy the world before that are trying to be reused again. And what's ended up happening is this jungle has taken over. It's toxic to humans and is defended by giant dangerous bugs. And the princess protagonist realizes that these bugs are protecting the forest, which is leaching all the poisons out of the ground from the nuclear holocaust. And that's why the jungles are toxic. But as the jungle moves out and radiates away from, ground zero, it's cleansed the world. And I'm like, that's really creative. That's a really well thought out, interesting world.
Well, one of the best novels I've read recently, where I was deeply impressed, by the way, that there were two that come to mind in terms of a well-executed world. And one is Max Brooks' World War Z. If you read the original, put the movie aside for a moment, they were like two completely different things. But if you read World War Z, the author did an amazing job of constructing this world that was consistent, went into detail and nuance that were fascinating to me. And the second is Canticle of Leibowitz, which was a winner from I think it was written in 1961 by Walter Miller. And I only just discovered that. It kept coming up in conversation, so I read it several months ago. And it was another one where the consistency and the brilliance of the world, of the writer and what he had created, was in so much of the nuance. So you had at one level the story he was telling, and you're trying to kind of figure out where this goes. And it's an apocalyptic novel. But it impressed me and inspired me, because I kept thinking, all right, if I'm going to do this, I've got to stop being so cavalier about it and actually get down into not just at a superficial level what this world is like, but when you dig into, like Tolkien did, when you have a rendering of a world that has poetry, that has backstory to the integrity, that just gets mentioned the way we reference and mention things of history or movies that we talk about, culture and all philosophy, theology, whatever it may be. You're thinking about, even at a subliminal level, a reality of a world. It just makes an impression when you're reading or watching something, when even those side glances, those side references, just tells you that this world is richer than just what's on the surface,
The iceberg.
Yeah,
it's the iceberg.
I think we like worlds in terms of world building. I think we really like worlds where it's apparent that we're in good hands. Mm-hmm. Whether we're reading them, whether we're watching them in films, we want to say, okay, we talked about this a lot, Paul, in Odyssey. I remember years and years ago, and pardon the crudity of this, but we had internal BS meters where when we did something, we would do something in a script, we would do something and I'm like, my meter's dinging over here. Yeah. It's not really happening for me. We gotta, not to say that we should cut that element out of a script, but we have to be able to explain it so that it plausibly can happen. Yeah. And plausibility of it is what I think we're really kind of hitting. We've sort of beaten around this a little bit, but I think that's what we're really looking at. We want to know that we're in a well thought out world. We've said that over and over again here in this conversation. I think that's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about world building. Was this all by accident, or was this a happy accident, or was this something that somebody put some thought into, and really tried to make a plausible world? Because again, what is art? What are we supposed to be doing with this? It's supposed to be helping us inform ourselves, about humanity, and about the core sensibilities of humanity and what is true to our humanity as creatures who were made by God.
One book that I read a couple of years ago, which was published about 10 years ago, which does a really good job of world building. It's kind of a parallel world building. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is like a parallel history of like English magic, with the last two wizards left trying to revive English magic, where it's dying out. And it's going on during the Napoleonic Wars. And there's all this, funny British dry humor. But the sort of like the idea of this old, like this parallel world of English magic that coexisted throughout the real world history of England, you get a sense that there's a lot there. even though the author, she's not giving you all of it at once or even throughout the whole book.
Well, and that's true. I mean, the best books don't. The best books show restraint in terms of how much they give you. I mean, the first historical novel I ever wrote, I succumbed initially to the James Michener school, which was you never unearth a fact or a piece of knowledge that you don't put in the book. But fortunately, I had an editor who kept coming back and saying, nope, this has nothing to do with your story. You really need to get rid of that. And I kept thinking, yeah, but do you know how many hours I spent trying to find that piece of information? But I realized and yielded to the good sense that not everything I know, everything I learn on a subject should be in the book. It's only what's relevant to the characters, the plot, the world. But the richness comes in the fact that there's a lot of stuff that I know that I might do a gentle reference to or hint at, not to show off, but because it's relevant to the dialogue or relevant to the character's understanding of a situation, which always then, again, it hints, like we said back at the beginning, it suggests that the world has a lot more to it. It suggests that this is a world worth being in, a world worth exploring. Yeah. And if it's worth it for me as the author and worth it for the characters to be discovering new things, then hopefully it's worth it for the reader. It's worth it for the viewer or the listener, that they just get that nagging sense that there's a lot more yet to be told, which makes it more exciting.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's like in the Bible where you only get what you need. There's a lot of things you could be told about Abraham that might be really interesting, but we don't need to know that to move the story along.
Right.
We get what we need.
It's simple. It's similar in a film, for instance, and with the art direction in a film and television program, to the characters drinking a cup of coffee that actually has liquid in the cup versus drinking a cup of coffee that there's nothing in there.
Yeah.
And you can tell that they're just kind of lifting it away. You want the weightiness of it. You want the substance of it. And the same kind of thing happens in books. The same kind of thing happens in stories. You want the substance. You want to believe that this world is greater than what we're just reading here. There's, like you were saying, Paul, there's more to this world than what we're just seeing or reading about or getting here. And then when you have those opportunities to throw those little nuggets in the right way, that's just icing on the cake. That's just making it even more fun.
Well, and I was laughing because of the two pet peeves that I have in certain films and TV shows. One is when they're having a telephone conversation and very clearly they're responding to something that the person on the other end of the line could not have possibly have said in the amount of time they're responding. So it's what? He's in the hospital. What? He's dying of leukemia. And how do they even say the word leukemia in that amount of time? Or the other one is when people are driving and they know they're not in a real car because they're doing this and talking to the person next to them. And everything in my instinct is going, look at the road, you're going to die if you don't look at the road. But clearly they're not going to die because they're not really in a car.
I'll add one to that. I'll add one more to that. The other thing that always bugs me, and this could just be my obsessive compulsive personality, but it's when somebody has been looking for something really important inside the context of the film, right? And they find it and they have it and then they use it and then they drop it someplace because they're dealing with some other villain and they never go back to pick it up. They never go back to see, it's this one thing that I've been walking around with the whole character the whole time has been walking around a backpack or this or that. And then they get into this fight or something where the backpack is across the room, but in the next scene they have the backpack with them again. It's like the thing is attached to them somehow. Or
but no, the worst thing, it'd be like Frodo with a ring and suddenly going, and this does happen, where it's like not in the movie, but here's Frodo with the ring, and he suddenly goes, "Where did I leave that? I think did I leave it back at the inn?"
Exactly.
Like how do you forget the thing? And then often those kinds of things show up in horror movies. Especially horror movies and places like that, where it's like the one thing that's going to kill the vampire is the one thing they left in a suitcase at the airport. I mean, it doesn't.
This is again. This is what drives me. It drove me a little crazy during, for instance, the Harry Potter films. Their wands are the most important thing that they have.
Yeah.
And they drop them and walk away from them. I don't know how many times they're dropping their wand because somebody, Ron has been splinched and we got to get him inside the tent. So they drop their wands outside and carry Ron back into the tent. And I'm like, what about what about their wands? Their wands, they're sitting right. But in the next,
but you know, Phil, you got to remember though, you got to project yourself backwards to your teenage years, because with teenagers, how often are car keys gone missing, wallets gone missing, things that you go, okay, how valuable is that to you, and you forgot it.
Right. I've got no problem with that. But you see, what you just described was there are consequences for forgetting where you put your keys.
Exactly.
But there are never consequences.
And in Harry Potter,
Wands.
Yeah, that's funny.
There was a question from one of the people watching. How does changing voice actors degrade world building in a story?
Yes.
Well,
it's bound to some degree, but remember, at least in the history of Odyssey and other things we've done, the change of voice actors were a necessity. They were not something we did capriciously. And the second thing is, and we know as a rule, whether it's filmmaking or audio or whatever, anytime you do something that makes the person, the listener, aware that they're dealing with an actor as opposed to a character, then you're sort of damaging. It doesn't damage the world, I don't think, because at some point we all know that if you change out, if you're watching Dennis the Menace and Mr. Wilson Next Door has to change into somebody else because the actor died, there's a point where you either roll with that or not, or you never recover from it. And in some cases, by the way, there are some TV shows that never recovered from the change. Because even if they try to explain it was a brother-in-law, a cousin, or it was a twin or whatever it was, you either miss the character that went or whatever, or you miss the actor. But in terms of world, though, it's just the unfortunate consequence of being actually a production. You know what I mean? That you're representing the world, and now you have to do something because an actor has passed away or something happened, and now you have to replace the actor as the voice. And we always on Odyssey would always have the discussion and the debate. Do we kill the character, or if not kill the character, I mean remove the character from the series, or literally the character dies because we can't find another voice, or we don't feel that another actor will ever capture that. So you remove the character, which is one option. And the other, in some cases, is to replace the actor because you want the character to live on and carry on because of the importance of the character to that world. Does that cover it? Because it's a good question, but it's sort of hard to answer.
What I find to be interesting about the question is that it's such a how do we put this? It's such a rarity. It's a problem that only series that are long-lived series really have.
Right.
So Doctor Who is going to have it, and then they built that into their whole world. But for us, I mean, we've gone on for 30 years, and when you have people who were in their 70s when we first started playing major characters, you add 30 years to that. Well, just physically speaking, you're going to lose some people as you go on. So then we have to figure out, like you said, well, what are we going to do with them? What are we going to do with the character?
Well,
kill the character off, or are we going to find? And we had when Hal Smith died, this was a big. And I think our initial thought was, well, let's just create a brand new series. let's just end this series and go on with something new. But that was not the plan. That didn't pan out that way.
Yeah, and it's difficult, as you say, about a long-term series, because if you're going to go literal, we determined what Whit would be at least 100 years old now.
Yeah. Well, definitely.
He's definitely in his mid-90s to 100, based on the touch points that we had in the series. So there is some degree of latitude that any audience on a long-term series is going to have to give to the producers in order to keep the series going.
So wait, do you mean like Bilbo? He has the ring of power that's giving him unnatural long years of life?
Yeah, well, actually, my solution, which we never applied to the question of Connie Kendall being the age that she was, but never seeming to age, was that we were going to find out that she was an android that Whit had actually created, and that she was never human. She was never human at all. She was an android, and a very successful one. But I don't know, for some reason we never got around to that.
Earlier in the week,
after Mitch, that would have led to some awkward.
Oh yeah, imagine his surprise.
We just had, actually, we kind of talked about this earlier this week. We had a session, and we were out, the folks were out here. I'm in California and you guys are in Colorado. They came out here to do their session, and we had dinner and stuff, and we were thinking about this. And I think Dave Arnold was the one who said, we've never really pinpointed how long this series is in terms of the time frame. Yes, we know how many years have passed now, but suppose this all happened within a 10-year time frame. We've just compressed it all the about 10 years worth of stuff, or 30 years worth of stuff. We just compressed into 10 years. So
Walking Dead did that. Walking Dead fans were trying to figure out the reality of the time based on the clues in the show, because we have that, in our writing, we have that, because you could do an episode where then the last scene is 2 weeks later and you're seeing the punctuation mark to that. But we never necessarily subscribe to the idea that from one season to the next, or where one series of 12 episodes ended and it resumed, was necessarily more than a day later. I mean,
right.
It's a 30, is it 900 days? If we got 900 episodes, is it 900 days? Or is it really 30 years? Or what is it really? But it can't be.
And the other things that play into that, of course, is how many things do you have going on in your life? Are we looking at one story in your life, or are we looking at 10 stories in your life that just happen to be being told parallel to each other? So Wits, it could have had five. We could have had 5 stories happening at the same time. We just heard them sequentially and focused on individual stories. But hey, you know what? They could have all been happening at the same time. And Wit's just this, Wit's a guy. That's what life is like that too. So
sure.
I think,
and Tolkien had to do that. Remember, in Tolkien, he had to do the same thing. He would shift the camera angle and follow these characters, tell their story, then would come back and tell the story of the other that was concurrent with the first one. But then, the movies then had to sequentially put them back of what would actually happen at a certain point in the chronology. And you could argue that that's a lot of what happens with what we're doing. So really, only 3 years has gone by since the first Odyssey episode. It's only been 3 years.
Does that mean that Rodney Rathbone is an android? Because he never gets older either.
Yeah, and actually, is Rodney Rathbone even around anymore?
Well, he was. Well, maybe not now, but I quit listening after Novacom, really. So.
No,
not really.
I know that you have to get going soon, Phil.
I do.
So
I do. I've got 3 minutes.
Up. So final statements, I guess.
Good conversation.
Yeah.
Actually,
we would both encourage people to be consistent in the world they build.
All right. Well, if we're all done.
No, Phil, what were you going to say?
My internet is cutting out.
Okay.
My internet is cutting out here, so I'm wondering what you're all saying. But if you're talking about a wrap-up statement, I would just say, the idea behind the consistency in the world is important, and you have a lot of thought in building. If you're going to do it well, it needs to be. It's writing is a thing, and you need to go into it with your eyes open.
Yep. What he said.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Phil.
Yep.
Todd Lewis signing off.